Trial delays, expert testimony, alleged victim identities, kisses? It's quite the day in court for Sean Diddy Combs. I'm going to bring on Law&Crime's own reporter Elizabeth Millner, who was in that courtroom to give us the updates on what happened in Combs' criminal case. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Okay, so I usually do an intro where I recap the criminal case of Sean Diddy Combs, what's been going on, but I don't want to do that right now. I want to get right into this. I want to bring on Elizabeth Millner, Law&Crime's reporter, who is in that courtroom for another pretrial hearing. Good to see you, Elizabeth.
Great to see you, too.
So this, again, is just weeks before Combs is set to go to trial on May 5th. He faces racketeering charges, sex trafficking, transportation to engage in prostitution. He's been hit with a third superseding indictment. And before we get into anything, I asked Elizabeth, I said to Elizabeth, you know, everybody wants to get into this courtroom. I remember during Weinstein, even though we were press, you had to wait till 5 in the morning. I said to Elizabeth, I go, Elizabeth, how'd you get into court? And what did you say to me?
I said through the door.
Through the door. Through the door. Dead serious. She goes, oh, through the door. Thank you for clearing that up.
It was a long hearing. I apologize for my blonde and ditziness.
Everybody outside is still laughing because that happened in real time. So I know you were able to get in, press badge and all. Yeah. First thing I have to ask is, Combs walks in. How does he look? What does he do? What does he say?
Yeah, so unfortunately this time around, my view was a little obstructed. We had the bailiff standing up. We had Brian Steele standing up. So I didn't
His new lawyer.
Yes, his new lawyer, and I'm sure we'll talk about that more in a second. But so I didn't see the moment of when he actually just first walked into the courtroom. But he sat down, and I did notice that he had hugged his attorneys. Obviously, this is the first time that Brian Steele was inside that courtroom after he had filed to be an addition to the defense team. But I did see Diddy shake his hand. So for the most part, he kind of just, from my view, just came in, sat down, but he seemed like he was just ready for the proceedings to begin.
I heard reporting that he blew kisses to the gallery.
So Diddy has a habit of doing that, especially to his family. And so actually when we had first all come into the courthouse, there normally is like a special section where his family does sit. It's on the row to the left of all the reporters. At first we were like, is Diddy's family coming? Are we going to see anybody? Then we saw that his mom Janice had come into the courtroom. So that was presumably who he's blowing kisses to. And then his son Justin Combs and a friend of Justin's, who by the way was wearing a free puff hoodie inside the courtroom, walked in a little bit after the proceedings had already begun, but I assume those blown kisses were specifically to his family, especially his mom.
That won't be allowed when that trial starts. Yeah. And let's talk about that. When is this trial starting? Why do I say that? Because there's been a lot of back and forth about whether the trial would be delayed for 2 months. I did a sidebar on this yesterday. This is what Diddy requested, a 2-month adjournment, a 2-month delay. Basically was making the argument that the government's still producing all this discovery material to him. It's regarding the new count 4, related to sex trafficking of victim 2, I believe. And the prosecution said, look, we learned this information late. We turned it over. They made the prior argument that the victims have a legal right for this trial to begin and not be delayed. So what was the discussion about a delay today from both sides, and what did the judge ultimately rule?
Well, the judge ultimately ruled that we are heading to trial not in the summer, not in July, August, whatever it may be. We're still going to be heading to trial next month. And pretty much
May 5th.
Yes, May 5th.
Yeah.
And pretty much his ruling kind of surrounded the fact that between Diddy's dream team, defense team, there's a lot of lawyers, right? There's a lot of lawyers amongst different law firms as well, too, where if they aren't feeling like they're getting enough time to respond to either subpoenas or paperwork or anything like that, there's an abundance of them, essentially. So that way someone can get this done in a matter that actually is timely. But also, with that being said, too, the judge was also just kind of discussing as far as the information that's in the third superseding indictment. That information hasn't been necessarily new information. The defense knew about the information and these issues prior. So really, was there a need to delay it 2 months? I'm sure the defense probably wanted that. But I was speaking with other lawyers who were also there in the gallery. And, you know, a lot of people were kind of pointing to why would they want to move the trial 2 months? And I know we had discussions about it, too. You were thinking initially that it was going to be moved. But then to their point, the lawyers that I was speaking to, who, by the way, are not attached to the case, they were talking about how difficult it is to have a summer trial. The jury pool is going to be a lot different. It's going to be hotter outside. So who knows what the outcome may have been had the trial been moved to the summer. But no, we know for a fact it will not be. It will not be delayed 2 months. It's still going full steam ahead beginning next month.
Wow. Wow, unbelievable. I also feel like money is going to play a huge role in Combs' upcoming trial, whenever that should happen. You know, wealth, power, resources. And in that vein, and since April is Financial Literacy Month, I bet you didn't know that, I didn't know that, we have this incredible sponsor who can help you stay on top of your finances, Experian. So the first step to take control of your credit and finances is to download the Experian app, which, by the way, has tons of free tools. Your free FICO score, so it can help you boost your FICO score instantly for free with Experian Boost. Free access to a marketplace of credit card, loan, auto insurance options that are matched to you. Free credit monitoring with real-time alerts to keep you in the know on changes to your Experian credit profile. And by the way, you can easily freeze your Experian credit file for free in the app, helping protect you against identity theft. So make sure your finances are always in great shape with Experian. Use the link in the description or scan the QR code to download the free app now. Results will vary. Additional terms may apply, and see the App Store for more details. Let me ask you this. Last time we spoke about, material being turned over and whether there's a delay, there's a lot of discussion about victim 4 in this case. Was there any discussion today in court about either, by the way, victim 4 or victim 5?
Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
Absolutely. I know on Tuesday when we had spoke, we were talking a lot about victim 4, who we know to be a former employee of Sean Diddy Combs. And a lot of the issues surrounding victim 4 in this particular part was about her emails. I can't confirm that this victim is a woman. But as far as her emails goes, the defense wanted the full scope of the emails that the government did not have access to. And so the defense, to their point, they just wanted the full extent of it so it can show a clear picture, because previously they were arguing that this alleged victim was just cherry picking messages and emails between herself and Diddy and sending it over to the government. The defense on their part, they wanted the full scope of the emails. But as far as the judge and his ruling, he said that requesting the full extent of the emails, which by the way are like 100,000 emails. It's a lot of emails, especially if you were having trial next month. But the request he had said, he being the judge, was a fishing expedition. But he said, and he kind of left the door open with this, that if the defense wanted to make a renewed motion pointing to specific emails, specific key terms, then they could go about filing the appropriate paperwork, see how they could go about doing that. But in terms of just getting all these hundreds of thousands of emails between alleged victim number 4 and Diddy himself, who, by the way, if we know, we discussed this on Tuesday, that if the correspondence was between Diddy, why won't they have access to the emails themselves? But I don't know the full scope of why they don't have those emails. Maybe they were deleted. Who knows exactly? But if the defense wanted to file a renewed motion to get these access to the emails, they could go about doing that, but only if they're going to point out specific key terms, specific key phrases, specific emails. Now, as far as victim 5, who was alluded to a little bit on Monday, but the full scope of who this alleged victim is, not necessarily clear on who this person is or anything like that. So in terms of victim 5, in terms of the arguments today, specifically, we're just kind of about, prior bad acts and how this person will testify as far as when the trial comes. So from my understanding of it, anything that was 20 years ago or anything like that, not saying that this victim in particular was somebody from 20 years ago or anything, but as far as the 404B motion, that was denied pertaining to victim 5. It was a little unclear.
Can I clarify what because we talked about this. So the defense, right, leading up to this, they had said the government wants to introduce all of this uncharged conduct, prior bad acts, alleged sexual assaults. Now, the defense said this is prejudicial. We won't have enough time to prepare. It's propensity evidence showing that, if he did this, he must have been guilty of this. It shows a character trait. Now, the prosecution was basically like, no, it's being used to prove you had an intent to sex traffic people. We're going to show you prior instances of sexual assault. So your defense of, everything was consensual doesn't work. Your defense of, it was a mistake, I didn't know that they didn't consent, doesn't work. And there was a whole back and forth. And I did a sidebar on when I thought this is such a significant issue, it might delay the case. But what you're saying is that maybe victim 5 is tied into this, and this was the only discussion regarding prior bad acts. I mean, do we know if they're going to be allowed in? To what extent?
Yeah, as far as everything, that was a little dicey just because, a lot of it was just legalese. That just kind of went a lot above my head. 404B, 403.
And by the way, you're coming back when we're recording this. I want you to know, she literally walked through the door and came into here. So Elizabeth is we're just doing this in real time.
Yes. So literally just ran out of the courthouse, gathered my notes, gathered my electronic devices, which they take away, and then just rushed back here to the office. So as far as just the prior bad acts go, from my understanding of it, a lot of it, the judge said that the court finds it's illusory in context. So as far as the time frames and whether or not they match up to another victims in the indictment, again, it was a lot unclear, but I'm sure the judge judge will file the appropriate paperwork, so that way we get the full ruling all in Judge Submarinian's voice.
But the big point is the trial's not delayed. This is not stopping. Now, talking about evidence coming from a victim, I want to talk about victim one, who we believe to be Cassandra Ventura in this case. Now, she had objected to, I believe, a subpoena from the defense, right? And I think the government jumped on this and said, we're agreeing with her because apparently, according to her, the defense wanted, and I'm reading this from a filing, the subpoena demanded that Redacted produce all draft memoirs, autobiographies, narratives, diaries, journals, or notes, and any communications about Redacted's plans to publish or threaten to publish such a document, all of Redacted's bank statements, that apparently Diddy wanted bank statements for 10 months in 2023, and her lawyer said this was premature, it needs to be limited. The defense says that her story, victim one's story, assuming it's Cassie, the one that she's telling the government is very different from her own writings. And they had a quote that said from one of their filings, Redacted seeks to shield important exculpatory information in her possession, and the government joins in that request. In particular, she and the government seek to conceal copies of her draft memoirs and other writings that memorialize a version of events that is markedly different from what she has told the government and will testify to a trial. Now, I think that's my understanding of it. What did you hear today in court from both sides regarding victim one, and what did the judge decide regarding information that she has to disclose?
Yeah, of course. Well, according to the judge, the motion to quash the subpoena was denied in part, and here's why. The judge ruled that victim one must provide the draft version of her memoir. Again, we know through sources or just the fact that she's even listed on court documents, that being Cassie. And to the defense, they have long alluded to and accused Cassie and her part, alleged victim one, just about wanting all of this for money or writing all of this for a book. She didn't meet the demands of what Diddy wanted in terms of payment or anything like that. And so pretty much they have long alleged that the reason she even drafted or filed her federal lawsuit was because Diddy didn't pay up or else she would release that memoir. So the judge did rule that she must provide the draft memoir, and the timing of the production needs to be produced by April 25th. But here, what I found interesting was the motion, just in terms of her finances and the bank statements. The judge said that's not relevant. Why do you need the bank statements from, again, alleged victim number one? So the judge said not clear why showing finances is even relevant, and it failed to meet the NXIVM standard. So she doesn't have to send over any of the bank records or anything like that because, you know, to me, just listening through that, it's like, why does she need to show bank statements? But again, the defense from their part is suggesting that maybe she wasn't having the best financial situation.
She had a financial motive to go after
Right,
him.
exactly. But she does not need to show her finances to the defense.
Talking Cassie for a moment, there's been a lot of discussion. I think we're going to do a sidebar on this next week about excluding the infamous videotape of Sean Combs purportedly beating Cassandra Ventura in 2016 in this hotel hallway. I think they want to try to get that out of evidence. Any discussion about the video today?
And so that's what we were all kind of hoping to hear, whether or not the judge would allow this into evidence. The government says that this piece of evidence is critical to their case. So the defense obviously wants it thrown out. And to me, the defense's argument is interesting because, of course, they're going to hammer on the fact that it's edited, it was sped up, how the video was even obtained to CNN in the first place. But I kept my ears open to see if there was going to be any mention of the assault tape. But no, the judge did not make a ruling on that. So it's unclear if that'll actually be admitted or if maybe we could hear about it more at a hearing at another date.
That's a complicated issue. I think the judge probably needs a little bit more time because, again, right, the defense has made the argument. This is, if it has to be admitted, they're making the argument so far, it's a domestic spat. It's unfortunate, but it's a domestic spat. The prosecution is like, no, this is evidence of sex trafficking because Cassie was running away from a room. Sean Combs ran out seemingly in a towel, and there was apparently a sex worker in that room. So I get it, both sides, but I guess I'm not surprised that they didn't bring it up today.
Yeah, I was hoping that they would because to your point, the defense has been very clear that they don't want this in. But the entire world at this point has seen it, and they've also subsequently seen that apology video as well, too, which, by the way, has been scrubbed from his social media page.
Don't worry, they have it.
Oh yeah, they have it. And we have it as well too. We have the full video. We did not forget it. So yeah, I'm surprised that there wasn't a ruling on that yet.
To what I was surprised about, there was mention of Warner Brothers today. Talk to me about what Warner Brothers' connection is to the case and what happened with Warner Brothers.
Yeah, the Warner Brothers piece is pretty interesting. So it has to do essentially with the investigation discovery documentary, The Fall of Diddy. And so they wanted a motion to quash when it comes to Warner Brothers because essentially the defense wants the outtakes from the interviews. And the government on their end say that the people that were interviewed in the documentary might also be witnesses in their case. And so I think particularly it comes down to the interviews between Diddy's former chef and Diddy's former personal assistant. Both were interviewed in that documentary and both gave very vulnerable accounts of their time that they had worked with Diddy. The former assistant had provided voice notes and talked about being pressured to engage in sexual activity at the behest of Diddy. And in terms of the personal chef, it was just more towards verbal abuse that she had witnessed during her time while working there. And so the defense wanted the outtakes of those interviews because it's kind of similar to the Donald Trump, Kamala Harris interview that they had done, you know, similar to just wanting the full scope of what was said, what wasn't said, that wasn't shown in the documentary. And obviously there are two different instances. So in terms of just Warner Brothers turning, well, one, the judge ruled that Warner Brothers does have to give the defense those outtakes.
They have to turn it out over, okay.
Yeah, and then the lawyer for Warner Brothers was actually inside that courtroom and obviously brought up the point that this is a holiday weekend, so they won't be able to produce it by Monday or anything like that. So likely Warner Brothers will have that out to the judge by the end of next week. So presumably Thursday, Friday, that type of.
See, one of the reasons I think this is so interesting and kind of gives us a preview of what to expect at trial, who's going to be called, what the arguments are going to be, and you know, I would say the most significant days are when the alleged victims testify.
Yeah.
Which brings me to anonymous victims. Mm-hmm. So a big concern has been, the prosecution said that victim 1 is going, and if again we believe this to be Cassandra Ventura, is going to testify in her own name, so we'll all know who that is. But when it comes to victims 2, 3, and 4, they want to testify under pseudonyms. They don't want to be identified. Need to avoid harassment, social stigma, humiliation from being exposed. And this is actually a good quote from one of the filings. In light of the significant media attention this case has generated, it is likely that the victims will be approached and harassed by members of the press and the public after their testimony. Publicizing their names will subject them to unwanted attention at the time they are testifying about some of the most difficult moments of their lives in a criminal sex abuse trial. Now, the defense has said Sean Combs has a Sixth Amendment right to confront his accusers, his witnesses. He has a right to a full public trial, that this prevents a full and complete cross-examination if they can't be identified, even though it appears both he and his attorneys and the jury will know who these people are. What was the discussion about anonymous alleged victims, and what did the judge decide?
Well, the judge, and I don't want to spoil it or jump to the gun too much, but the judge said that the victims 2, 3, and 4 will go on into pursuing anonymity. So they won't be using their real names, whether or not they'll be Jane Doe, Jane Smith, or, you know, alleged victim ABC. That's unclear at this point. But in terms of the usage of their names, that will not be permitted. But the defense's arguments about that were, to me, a little bit interesting in terms of just how they'll be able to go about logistics, in terms of if the defense were to question, for example, Jane Doe 2. Yeah. And Jane Doe 2 is just testifying under direct, they get to cross, and then they have to be kind of dicey in terms of other witnesses who can also testify, other witnesses being defense witnesses who can also be able to get on the stand and be like, oh no, Jane. Yeah, exactly. So
be like, yeah, I know exactly what you're saying.
Right.
They might inadvertently mention the name of victim 2.
Yes, and so I can picture becomes very, very dicey. And so while the defense did want to push for the names to be at least revealed in some capacity for them to go about doing their jobs, because, you know, Diddy does have the right to have a great defense team, you know, obviously. We know that within our court of law system. But in terms of whether or not they will be using their real names, that won't be happening. But I could see why it could be a little dicey, especially because if I'm a regular person, I'm getting up on the stand and obviously I'm told I cannot use this person's name, but it just slips up. What happens then when it does slip up?
There's inadvertent mistakes.
Exactly.
But this is a danger.
It is a danger. But also what I found particularly interesting too is, I guess, Tinny Garagos was kind of making the arguments about.
That's one of his defense attorneys,
yes,
right?
Yes, exactly. The daughter of Mark Garagos, the famed attorney as well too. But I guess she had been in contact with alleged victim 3's lawyer, and the reaction, I guess, about alleged victim 3 in particular when it comes to testifying under anonymity. This was a very interesting point in court today where Tinny Garagos said that alleged victim 3's lawyer said that she felt, meh, about whether or not to use her actual name. So it doesn't seem like, to the government's point, that all of these women who we can confirm that they are women, that some of them from the government's letter made it seem like they were just so in fear of testifying under their real name. But from what Tinny Garagos was arguing is that alleged victim number 3 is just kind of,
Was it so about her being identified or so about her testifying?
So about her being identified. I think it comes with possibly the weight of having to testify against Diddy, that somehow, some way, maybe if she made an interview or maybe she might be recognizable to us as reporters or even just anybody in the gallery, that might come out. So I think there's still that fear within the victim or alleged victims to testify, knowing that somehow, some way, it might say who these people are.
Talking about testifying, what about expert testimony? So we did a sidebar here where a very controversial witness, Dr. Dawn Hughes, am I right about that? Who actually testified in the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial. Prosecution wants her to testify, the defense doesn't. Explain to us what the arguments were and what came out in court today about expert testimony about, she's a psychologist, correct?
Yep, she's a psychologist, but the defense points out that Dr. Hugh hasn't spoken to any of the alleged victims in this case in particular, but pretty much as far as her testimony and what it could possibly look like, the judge wants it to be very clear that this particular witness will not testify to coercive control. So obviously Diddy is charged with sex trafficking by force, fraud, and coercion. And so in terms of using this particular phrase, coercive control, the judge said that Dr. Hughes won't be able to testify using that phrase, kind of suggesting that it already paints the defendant, that being Diddy, in a light that alleges that he is already guilty of the crimes.
Right, and it presumes his guilt of it.
Exactly, as opposed to just...
And the court basically was like, and correct me if I'm wrong, did the court was like, these are jurors who have common sense. They know all this stuff already?
Yeah, exactly. And so if the victim were to be, for some people to talk about whether or not, because the defense always wants to paint it out like this was a bad relationship, gone wrong, that type of thing. But if this particular expert witness can testify about, I'm using this loosely, coercive control and just how a lot of victims stay or a lot of victims use different coping mechanisms to go forward with activities that they necessarily don't want to do. The judge was kind of pointing out that jurors can kind of decipher things that are in between the lines in terms of...
They don't need an expert.
Exactly. Drug use or alcohol use to kind of go along with whatever they may have been allegedly...
You don't need an expert. That the jurors already bring in their common understanding.
Yes.
So and so there's a danger of her testifying because the jurors might latch onto it and make a conclusion they're not supposed. She's supposed to just testify generally about something, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And then for the defense's part, they want to bring their own rebuttal expert witness, that being Dr. Bardet. But they are only bringing Dr. Bardet, I think, to counter Dr. Hughes's testimony. So if Dr. Hughes wasn't going to be a part of the case, Dr. Bardet wouldn't be a part of the case, that type of sort. So in terms of just whether or not the full scope of what the government wants to put in or what the defense wants to put in, the judge will actually kind of consider the whole scope of the ruling just next week. So preliminary view from the judge was no reference to coercive control, and if Dr. Hughes testifies, then Dr. Bardet will also testify as well too. But in terms of what Dr. Hughes can specifically talk about, that's still kind of up in the air. But what we do know is that there should be no reference to coercive control.
Okay, and speaking about the jurors, I also read, I want you to expand upon this, there was a discussion about what the jurors can be asked during the jury selection process, about particularly sexual assault. Not surprising. You want to know if the jurors have experience with sexual assault, right? Even though he's not charged necessarily with sexual assault, allegations of sexual assault are implicit in this racketeering and sex trafficking and transportation to engage in prostitution case. What was the conversation about that in court today?
Yeah, of course. So the conversation had to do with the jury questionnaire and the edits that they're going to be doing, especially from the government's point of view. So the edits have to be in by Tuesday. The government proposes questions about jurors having prior sexual abuse, physical abuse, and the government was proposing that those be asked during the one-on-one. So what we do know is that the jury will be sequestered for jury selection and during that process. But from the government's point of view, that they were a little worried about them writing it down and how that will kind of go about, whether or not it gets access to the public or anything like that. And the defense says that the jurors might be scared to speak about it, frankly, instead of just writing it down and talking about their abuse. I mean, that seems difficult in itself. So what they did come up with and what ended up being the solution was that the government proposed just having a box selection. So when they're filling out the juror questionnaire, obviously that's not going to be asked in the first round or anything like that, but for those who are going to be moving forward, possibly to be selected to be on the jury, the government proposed kind of having a box selection to check off whether or not this particular juror wants to discuss it in person or write it down. So that's the decision that they both sides ended up agreeing to. Mark Agnifilo particularly nodded to that. So it seemed like both sides were okay with just that little box and whether or not they were going to talk about it freely or if the juror felt more comfortable just writing it down.
By the way, when you said Mark Agnifilo, and we're talking about the defense attorneys, you mentioned Brian Steele. So Brian Steele, who represented Young Thug, is now officially a part of Sean Combs' team, right?
Yeah.
What happened today?
Yeah, so I actually saw him when I was standing in line to get into the courtroom.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I saw him just kind of walking by. I was like, oh, that's Brian Steele in the flesh.
Yeah.
So he was there in court. It was interesting because right before the judge came into the courtroom and right before, everyone all rises or anything like that, Brian Steele, and I noticed that because he did this kind of in the Young Thug case as well, too. He just was standing up the entire time. And I don't know if it was like nerves or just kind of making his presence known, but he was just standing up, which, by the way, kind of obstructed my view to look at the defendant in his. I know. So thank you, Brian Steele, for that. I appreciate that. I'm just kidding. But yeah, he made his presence known. He didn't make any arguments today in court or anything like that. But what I did particularly notice is whenever we were waiting for the judge to come in, because there's kind of this long pause between the defendant coming in and between the judge taking the bench. And so during that time where we were all just kind of waiting for the judge to come in, Brian Steele kind of went from where all the lawyers sit or the defense table and sat in the gallery to speak to Diddy's mother. And so I don't know what was said or anything like that. And maybe, who knows, maybe it was Janice Combs who reached out to Brian Steele on behalf of her son to get him on this case. But it seemed like she was happy to see him. He gave her some kind words, that type of thing. Now, to the full effect of what was said, that is not clear.
Sure.
But when Diddy came into the courtroom himself as well, too, I don't know if they had met prior or anything like that to him filing that official paperwork, but he didn't hug, Diddy didn't hug Brian Steele, but just shook his hand. So maybe that was just like that.
Yeah, he probably doesn't know him yet. Probably takes some time before you're in the good
before
graces.
he opens up to him.
Before I let you go, I want to talk about counts 3 and 5. A lot of talk about counts 3 and 5. So this is the transportation to engage in prostitution, right? It's this idea of transporting sex workers that had engaged in sex acts with victims 1 and victims 2, transporting them across state lines. I think it's 10 years in prison is what you might be looking at there. It's Mann Act, right? And the defense had previously said these are racist. It's being used to prosecute a black man, that if you look at similar cases where you have white defendants, they haven't been charged with this. Prosecution came back and said that's not true. That if you look at similar cases, either this case is more egregious or this case has more specific kinds of facts, but they kind of disputed that. But it was very interesting because you heard basically the defense say these charges should be dropped because the prosecutors had a racist motive and intent behind filing these charges. What was said today? What did the judge decide regarding counts 3 and 5?
Yeah, well, it looks like counts 3 and 5 will still be here.
Okay.
And it's interesting, too, because I remember initially, Diddy at first was charged with counts 1, 2, and 3, and then the filing for count 3 particularly being racist and all of that. Then another superseding indictment came, and then another count was added, and that being count 5 of the exact same charge. But as far as it being removed or anything like that, the judge just denied that. So Diddy is still charged with the same 5 charges, or not the same 5 charges, but at least the 5 charges that have been alleged out in the indictments, the many indictments that we've been seeing since this case had first began. But it'll be continuing, and so the jurors will have to decide whether or not they believe it's racist or not, to the defense's argument. But it seems like it's still there.
I actually believe that's probably the most straightforward charge to convict him on. If they have the receipts, the travel records to say he was transporting sex workers, that's the toughest one, I think, out of the racketeering and sex trafficking. There are ways to say that it might not apply to him. I don't know if it's successful, but everybody that I've spoken to, and I think it too, those are probably the most straightforward charges. But we'll see.
It seemed like a Hail Mary, too, to kind of throw that out, the defense.
They tried.
Yeah.
They tried because I think those are the ones they might be the most concerned about. And, if you talk about racketeering, a criminal enterprise, is it really a criminal enterprise?
Right.
Was there a conspiracy afoot? Sex trafficking? Their argument is if he had relationships with girlfriends, traveled with them, bought them gifts, how do you classify that as sex trafficking? Because what we know is a common characteristic or a common example of sex trafficking is somebody who transports minors from one country to another and sells them off for sex work. This is a little bit different, and we're seeing prosecutions for sex trafficking in different areas, like the Alexander brothers, right? So there's an avenue for them to defend Combs on the sex trafficking racketeering case. I think there is. But when it comes to these two charges, it might be more straightforward for prosecutors. And not good for Combs that they are continuing. But Elizabeth Millner, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
You got it. Thanks for being our eyes and ears in court.
Of course.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.